For 8 seasons, many viewers rooted for Dexter Morgan, a serial killer, often overlooking the most crucial question: what would the FBI do if they ever truly investigated him? They already have a precise term for someone like him: an organized, mission-driven offender. Nearly every marker the behavioral analysis unit uses to identify this type perfectly aligns with Dexter Morgan. Robert Hare's psychopathy checklist, the very scoring tool used by the FBI globally to assess psychopathic traits, shows Dexter aligning with almost every characteristic across multiple analyses. The only trait he clearly avoids is violating parole, simply because he is never apprehended. Nearly every box on that checklist is checked. The show wants you to believe that his code is the sole safeguard protecting society, yet the reality is far more unsettling. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit developed specific categories for the type of killer Dexter Morgan represents long before the show ever aired. He didn't invent a new kind of threat, rather, he perfectly matched a profile they had already meticulously documented. The BSU was formally established in 1972, with agents Robert Ressler and John Douglas pioneering research into violent offenders by traveling to prisons and interviewing serial killers directly. Ressler is even credited with coining the term serial killer in 1974. Through this groundbreaking work, the FBI built a system of categories that became foundational to how law enforcement tracks violent offenders. The central distinction they drew was between organized and disorganized offenders. The organized killer tends to be above average in intelligence, socially functional, holds steady employment, plans carefully, and understands how to avoid leaving evidence behind. They meticulously control their environment and expertly cover their tracks. Criminologist David Wilson, in a Vanity Fair video analysis, directly stated that Dexter fits the mission-driven serial killer category, calling him the ultimate organized serial murderer. According to the FBI framework, the organized killer typically operates across 3 distinct locations: where the victim is taken, where the kill happens, and where the body is disposed. Dexter executes all 3 phases with a level of discipline the BAU would immediately recognize. He injects victims with M99 to immobilize them, meticulously wraps kill rooms in plastic sheeting to prevent leaving any evidence, then dismembers the bodies, bags the parts, and dumps them into the Gulf Stream from his boat. The VICAP system, the FBI's national database for violent crimes launched in 1985, exists specifically to connect killings across different cities and states by matching patterns in how the killer operates. The same sedative, the same plastic, the same ocean disposal, a consistent pattern like this would significantly increase the chances of detection, especially once cases were linked across different areas. The show asks you to accept that the most organized, pattern-consistent serial killer in Miami's history goes undetected for years while working inside the very department that handles homicide evidence. The FBI's entire profiling system was built to catch precisely this type of person. Dexter Morgan aligns closely with established offender profiles while combining traits that make him particularly challenging to place in a single category. However, the profile is only half the problem. The other half is where he works and what that position actually grants him access to. The most dangerous aspect of Dexter Morgan is not his kill room or his body count, it is his position within a trusted institution that renders him invisible. And the show meticulously documents exactly how he leverages that position. Harry Morgan didn't just teach Dexter how to kill, he taught him how to disappear within a police department. Dexter was trained from a young age to think like a detective, understand how evidence works, and know what investigators look for, ensuring they find nothing. He then spends nearly 2 decades inside Miami Metro Homicide as a blood pattern analyst. He has direct access to case files, suspect records, lab equipment, and the day-to-day thinking of detectives who are unknowingly working the very cases his targets originate from. Through his friendship with an evidence room employee named Camilla Fig, he obtains files on killers released on legal technicalities. He appears at court hearings as a forensic witness, using that access to identify future targets. He had worked on hundreds of homicide cases during his career at Miami Metro even before Season 1 begins. Psychopathy researchers like Kevin Dutton have described traits such as charm, manipulation, and emotional distance that align closely with how Dexter is portrayed. Hervey Cleckley, a psychiatrist who spent decades studying this type of person, wrote about it in his book, The Mask of Sanity, decades before the show aired. This mask is not something Dexter puts on occasionally, it's a constant performance that holds up under professional pressure, workplace relationships, and close personal connections simultaneously. Someone who scores near the top of the psychopathy checklist, understands forensics, and has access to homicide evidence for nearly 2 decades is not a complicated situation. He is the highest risk insider threat the BAU specifically trains law enforcement to identify. His charm is not a side trait, it is the main tool that keeps everything else running. Once you understand the position he operates from, the next question is whether the mission he claims to be on is actually what's driving him at all. The show presents Dexter's motivation as moral. Yet, the actual pattern of behavior across the series tells a different story, and the FBI's own offender categories explain why. The mission-driven serial killer, as defined in FBI research, is someone operating from a self-assigned sense of purpose. They believe they are making the world better. Researchers have noted, however, that the stated mission is rarely what is truly driving the behavior. The underlying need for power and control tends to be the real engine. When criminologists analyzed how Dexter actually conducts his kills, a clear inconsistency emerged. He has had victims completely immobilized on his table. He arranges photos of evidence of their crimes around the room. He takes his time. He talks to them. This is the behavior of someone who needs to be completely in control of another person's fate, not someone who simply wants a result. A purely mission-driven killer, by the FBI's own framework, is focused on the outcome. Dexter is focused on the process. That gap is important because it shows that Harry's code is not actually controlling him, it is giving him a reason that makes the killing feel acceptable inside his own head. When Rita is killed and he murders a man named Rankin in a rage in Season 5 because Rankin insulted her memory, Harry's voice in his head calls it the first human thing Dexter has done since Rita died. Killing out of rage has nothing to do with the code. In Season 8, Dr. Evelyn Vogel, who helped Harry build the code in the first place, plainly describes Dexter's psychology. His need to kill was born in a specific moment of trauma, and he has never left it. The code did not change its direction, it gave his violence a story to explain itself. The need for power and control in his kills places him closer to a process-focused killer than a purely mission-driven one. When you combine that with a moral justification and the ability to leave almost no physical evidence behind, you get a combination that sits right at the center of the FBI's highest risk category. Now, here's where it gets truly interesting, because the FBI actually came close. And what stopped them had nothing to do with Dexter being too clever. Season 2 is the closest the show gets to testing real investigative methods against Dexter. What it reveals is that the investigation didn't fail because Dexter was too smart, it failed because he was inside the institution running it. When 18 sets of remains are found in the Gulf Stream, the case becomes a joint investigation between the FBI and Miami Metro. FBI Special Agent Frank Lundy leads the federal side and constructs a real behavioral profile. He identifies the killer as someone with forensic knowledge, connections to law enforcement, and a system for selecting targets based on confirmed criminal history. That profile was pointing squarely in the right direction. The investigation lands on Sergeant James Dokes, not because he is guilty, but because Dexter plants evidence against him. Dokes ends up trapped in a cabin in the Everglades and dies when Lila West burns it down. A man who had been watching Dexter correctly since Season 1 ends up dead and permanently labeled the worst serial killer in Miami Metro history. Lundy returns in Season 4, still unsatisfied with the Dokes conclusion, and dies before he can re-examine it. Captain Maria LaGuerta spends Season 7 correctly piecing together that Dokes was framed. She is killed before she can finish. The investigative methods were working. The profile was accurate. The process failed because the person it was closing in on was inside the building, with access to the evidence and the ability to redirect what the investigators were allowed to see. Without the ability to interfere internally, investigators like Lundy were already moving towards a profile that closely matched Dexter. The real problem exposed by the Bay Harbor case is that a police department's evidence was compromised from the inside deeply enough that a framed sergeant became the permanent official answer to an active serial killer case. That is not the story of an uncatchable person, that is the story of what an insider threat does to systems built to stop him. What happens when someone outside those systems decides to emulate Dexter is where this gets even darker. The real-world cases connected to the show provide the clearest possible look at what the mission-driven framework actually produces when it moves from fiction into real life. Mark Andrew Twitchell, a filmmaker from Edmonton, Canada, was found guilty of first-degree murder in April 2011 for killing 38-year-old John Brian Altinger on October 10, 2008. His case drew international media attention because of his documented obsession with the Dexter franchise. Twitchell ran a Facebook page under the name Dexter Morgan, writing posts from the character's point of view. He rented a garage, covered the windows in plastic sheeting, set up a table, and created a fake female profile on a dating website to lure men. He attacked Altinger with a metal pipe, stabbed him to death, and dismembered the body. Police found a deleted file on his laptop called SK Confession, where SK stood for serial killer. It opened with, "This story is based on true events. This is the story of my progression in becoming a serial killer." In the document, Twitchell wrote that he wanted to pay tribute to the character. Steve Lilibuan, an investigative journalist who spent years corresponding with Twitchell for his book, The Devil's Cinema, called Twitchell's claim that Dexter had nothing to do with his crimes a logical disconnect. Then forensic testing revealed exactly where reality separated from the show. The plastic sheeting did not stop blood from soaking into the concrete underneath. Chemical testing illuminated the entire floor. Twitchell had absorbed the look and the self-justification without the actual technical knowledge, and the physical evidence exposed everything. What travels from the show into the real world is not the careful target research or the forensic discipline. What travels is the framework that tells someone their violence is justified. That is the most dangerous piece of the template because it requires no special skills to absorb. Anyone already drawn towards violence and already looking for a reason can take that part of the show and run with it, with none of the safeguards the code is supposed to provide. Consider, if the FBI pulled up Dexter Morgan's behavioral profile tomorrow, in which season do you think they would have caught him and why? While everyone focuses on the people Dexter kills, almost nobody talks about the damage that never shows up in any body count. People track the body count, almost nobody tracks the separate record of evidence interference and institutional damage running underneath every season. And that is where the most lasting harm actually sits. Beyond the killings, the show documents Dexter interfering with active police investigations, using fake identities, planting evidence, illegally obtaining substances to use on targets, and falsifying official records across every season. These are not occasional moments, they are things he does constantly to keep his operation running. When he frames Dokes in Season 2, every family of a Bay Harbor butcher victim gets an official conclusion built entirely on evidence Dexter manufactured. Miami Metro closes the case. There is no process to revisit a case that is officially resolved. When he kills Jonathan Farrow in Season 4, believing Farrow murdered one of his models, he is wrong. The next morning, Detective Angel Batista arrests Farrow's assistant Timothy Braun with DNA and camera evidence that makes the case airtight. Braun was the killer the whole time. Farrow had been telling the truth during the entire kill room confrontation. Dexter breaks Farrow's collection slide and moves on. Nothing can be corrected. The wrong person is dead, and the right answer came one day too late. What the show never explicitly addresses is the potential contamination across the hundreds of cases Dexter worked on as a blood pattern analyst at Miami Metro. He used lab equipment to confirm targets before kills. He shaped forensic conclusions to protect himself. Any case he had a hand in now carries the question of whether his analysis was done honestly or done to serve his own operation. A real version of Dexter inside a real department does not produce a clean, contained operation. He produces a department whose evidence record is quietly and permanently damaged with no way to check what went wrong or when. That damage never shows up in a body count. It sits in closed case files that nobody knows to look at again. Put all of that together, and the final picture looks nothing like the story the show has been telling you. The Behavioral Science Unit spent decades from 1972 forward studying and warning about the organized, mission-driven, institutionally embedded offender. They built VICAP to detect consistent patterns across different cities and states. They developed the psychopathy checklist to identify the psychology sitting underneath a normal-looking surface. Dexter Morgan aligns with nearly every trait on that checklist. His 3-location kill operation runs with the kind of consistency VICAP was specifically designed to flag. His position inside Miami Metro represents the highest-risk version of the insider threat the BAU trains law enforcement to identify. The show works because it gives you his internal voice. You hear his reasoning as it happens. You see what his targets did before you see what he does in response. By the time he acts, you've already taken in his justification without realizing it. Now remove that voice. Look at what the pattern produces across the full run of the franchise: well over 800 confirmed and implied victims, 1 innocent man killed, 3 people connected to investigations into him end up dead, the Bay Harbor case permanently closed on a man who was framed, hundreds of cases with potentially compromised evidence and no way to review them, Harrison Morgan now operating in Resurrection as the second generation of the same cycle, and Mark Twitchell in Canada, where the mission framework transferred to someone who had no code to slow down what came next. The FBI warned about this type of person. They built entire units and tracking systems around finding exactly him. The show just gave him an internal voice and a reason you could sit inside comfortably for 8 seasons. Dexter Morgan is one of the greatest characters in television history. As a real profile operating inside a real institution, he is the case study the Behavioral Analysis Unit would be pointing to for the next 20 years.